I'd like to have seen this come out in your discussion with Musk, because I think he pointed to a form of agnosticism to begin with. And then when talking about antinatalism, he said something along the lines of, it's obviously ridiculous to think that the world is just suffering. And to quote to paraphrase the late, great Dan Dennett, he said that we should only begin to criticize our opponents after we express their ideas in such a way that they go, oh, I wish I put it like that. That's great. And I don't think the antinatalist says everything is suffering, as you pointed out there. They say the world has more suffering than it does happiness, that all happiness and pleasure is bracketed in suffering and pain. This is the Buddhist idea, the Schopenhauerian idea, the views of David Benatar and David Pearce, the negative utilitarians who want to eliminate suffering. And that means, and I asked David Pearce this, a transhumanist, I asked him once, well, if you're a negative utilitarian and you think the moral goal is to remove suffering, why don't you just blow up the world? Why don't you just give us drugs that make us feel nothing? And he said, well, I don't think I'm going to get voted in if I say I'm going to blow up the world, but I certainly would like to do it. And it's like, you got to admire the honesty there, right? Maybe he should start telling a few politicians lies to get himself to what he takes to be the moral end. But ultimately, though, I think you're exactly right that the problem with trying to quantify, measure the amounts of good and evil that's in the world is a hopeless project. We can't, and you mentioned evil God a moment ago. There's this popular challenge in philosophy of religion that says, look at all the good and evil in the world. Who's to say that God is good rather than evil? And that's the essence of that challenge. And it works because it's really hard to quantify these things, especially when you're not just counting pains, pleasures, happinesses and the like, but you're also seeing what goods and bads they ultimately lead to. You can play that game all day long. But there's one thing that the anti-antinatalist has up their sleeve, and that's to say that existence itself is intrinsically good. Existence and being sit at the top of Jacob's ladder. That given the choice, and take John Rawls, you mentioned Marx, let's use another lefty-looking political figure in political theory. John Rawls said, imagine you're behind this veil of ignorance and you've got to create the world. And we can change this a bit for the purposes of our discussion. Now, you're given the choice whether to bring in life and conscious beings and not. You don't know how much happiness, pain, pleasure they're going to experience, how much suffering they're going to experience when they're in the world. And he asks, well, we're asking on behalf of Rawls, would you bring things into being still, not knowing how much happiness and suffering they'd experience? I think we'd all say yes still. I think there is no person that I know of anyway that legitimately defends the intrinsic disvalue of life. Even David Benatar, the most prominent antinatalist, doesn't think that life is intrinsically bad. He thinks that the suffering and pain in the world overrides the intrinsic goodness of the world. And I think that is ultimately something that goes in the antinatalist's favor.
So, okay. So I guess my first response to that question to you as well is that it isn't obvious to me that the axis of happiness and suffering is the right axis of evaluation. We seem to believe that it's self-evident that it's, let's say, something approximating pleasure versus pain. But that is not the only, what would you say? Those aren't the only interpretive frameworks that are accessible. So I'll give you an example, a biblical example, which I think deals with this point extremely well. And so the first great hero of the biblical texts is Abraham. And you could think of Abraham as the expression of Seth, who's the third son of Adam and Eve, right? So you have the battle between Cain and Abel. Abel dies, and Seth is his replacement. If you were searching for the spirit of Seth, it would be Abraham. Okay, so here's what happens to Abraham. It's very, very interesting. So we're presented with Abraham at the start of his story, but he's an old man already. And he's a man who's lived a life that hasn't been characterized by suffering. So he has the socialist paradise at hand, in a sense, because Abraham is the child of wealthy parents. And there's not a lot of biographical information in the text, but what we do know is that whatever Abraham wanted, he got. And that was sufficiently, like Buddha, before Buddha is struck down by knowledge of death and mortality. Abraham's in the same situation. It's the situation of childhood paradise. That's a good way of thinking about it, unconscious childhood paradise. Now, God comes to Abraham in a very specific form. And God comes to Abraham as the voice that compels him to leave his security and voyage into the world. And that's precisely the instruction, is that Abraham is to leave his kin and the security of his wealthy father's dwelling and to go out into the terrible world. And it is a terrible world because Abraham has a very cataclysmic adventure: war, tyranny, famine, like sexual conflict, deep sexual immortality, the requirement for profound sacrifice. Like, Abraham has a life, and it's not hedonic. Okay, so then you might say, well, if the solution to life's conundrums isn't pleasure as opposed to pain, because that's what Abraham has to begin with, what exactly is on offer? Okay, so God makes Abraham a deal. This is the covenant, by the way. He makes him a very specific deal. He says, if you hearken to the voice that compels you outward, that takes you from your zone of comfort, you can think about that as the voice of adventure, 4 things will happen to you. You'll become a blessing to yourself. So that's a good deal, right? So you're not living in misery. Now, your life isn't pleasure and the absence of pain. Now it's characterized as something approximating a blessing. You'll do that in a way that will make your name validly renowned among your fellows. You will do that in a manner that enables you to establish a dynasty of permanence, and you'll do it in a way that's a blessing to everyone else. Now, imagine for a second, tell me what you think about this, because there's a real technical claim here. So, children have to move beyond the zone of comfort provided to them by their parents. They have to move out into the terrible world. All right, so, and there's an instinct that compels them forward, that encouraging parents admire and foster. Go out. Now, that parents know that their children are going to be hurt by the world, but they want to make them competent. Now, what God offers in the Abrahamic story isn't pleasure, and it's certainly not the absence of pain. It's something like noble romantic adventure. And that's way different. That's a way different vision. And it's an interesting vision, even if you think about fiction and entertainment, because the entertainment forms that people prefer aren't representations of the absence of pain or of hedonic gratification. They're almost always representations of romantic adventure. And so I'll just add one more thing to that, because it also addresses something else you pointed out. And this is the idea that God wouldn't produce a world where evil could reign in the manner that it does. But I would say I'm not so sure about that, because there's a serious insistence in the biblical text, for example, that what human beings have to do is vital and real.
Yeah.
Right? It's not some sideshow. And what that implies is that if you do things correctly, there will be spectacularly positive consequences, let's say, and maybe unimaginably spectacular consequences. But if you do things wrong, like, there's no bottom to the abyss. Now, that's a very demanding world. But I don't know, like, you think about your own kids, like, you want to set a challenge in front of them. And if you wanted to challenge someone to be everything they could be, if they were everything they could be, then would the challenge have those archetypal poles of hell and heaven?